Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Rank 10 Yu-Gi-Oh's Legacy of the Worthless! If you aren't familiar yet, in this series we're looking at the most infuriatingly unplayable archetypes ever shed out by Konami's executive asshole, what exactly makes those archetypes so horrible, and what needs to be improved in order for them to be less awful. The grading scale we use involves consistency, power, comeback ability, protection and versatility, and an archetype is considered terrible if it doesn't particularly excel in any of these categories. With that said, let's begin this episode's topic. Reptiles might just be the most infuriatingly underrepresented monster type in the game. Whereas Roxo, Plane, Koaki, Meru and Thunder had their fair share of glory in Batteryman, Watts and Hunters, the presence of reptiles is entirely limited to the inefficient aliens, irrelevant venoms, disappointing reptilian, and of course, the directionless worms. As part of the first dual terminal storyline, worms are the first archetype we're looking at which did not originate from the anime. So yeah, no worries, the show isn't the only source of loads of unplayable garbage. For that we also have the lovely aforementioned dual terminal series, the card game epitome of quantity over quality. Most of the archetypes from this continuity could easily be described as gimmicky and eccentric or unconventional in design, and worms are a great example of the pointless gimmick aspect, because they consist of 26 monsters based on the letters of the English alphabet. And because of that, as opposed to my usual format, we'll be going from A to Z instead of lower to higher levels, so let's start learning ABCs with Rank 10 Yu-Gi-Oh! And kick it off with Worm Apocalypse. Flip. Target one spell or trap card on the field, destroy that target. That's one way to waste a cool name, I guess. Have a weak level 1 with a crappy effect be called Worm Apocalypse. That's something you leave for a boss monster, not this. But yeah, this marks the start of the worm's other gimmick. Most of them are flip effect monsters, and while the concept was proven to have an insane amount of potential strength by Shadows, a slow, crappy flip effect version of MST is not how you start off an archetype. B is for Barses or Barse or however you pronounce that, and while looking like a Ben 10 transformation, his effect is equally as unimpressive. When he's normal summoned, you can change one defense position monster on the field to face up attack position. I guess the idea behind this was to trigger the flip effects of worms that are already face down for whatever reason, because I really don't think the opponent would be putting their monsters to defense while cowering in fear before the might of the worms. But even so, it's pretty damn slow and most worms that are already on the field when you summon this tend to be face up, so no, not worth it. C is for CARTAROS, because the English language makes no sense, and this one is actually not that terrible. Flip. Add one level 4 or lower reptile type worm monster from your deck to your hand. So yeah, this is pretty tolerable. Average Searcher keeps up with the theme of the deck by being a flip monster, and while that does make it kinda slow, it's one of the very few tools the archetype has in the terms of consistency. It's good for worm standards, which are admittedly pretty damn low. The exact opposite of decent, which would be below average, is Worm DIMIKLES. Flip. This card gains 300 attack and defense. Here we have to understand that this was the period when Konami was still under the impression that stats matter that much, let alone a 300 stat boost. Unless your opponent is playing something like level 1 normal monster beatdown, DIMIKLES having 1700 defense and 2000 attack won't matter in the slightest for the outcome of the duel, leaving it in the trash pile with the majority of this archetype. Representing the E letter is Worm EROKIN, which is a level 6 monster with the following effect. This card cannot be special summoned. Once per turn you can change one face-up reptile type worm monster on the field to face-down defense position. I would argue that this would have been a tolerable effect if this was a level 4 monster, or it could be special summoned, but since EROKIN is neither of these things and the archetype doesn't exactly have much in the way of tribute fodder, EROKIN ends up being way too slow and completely unnecessarily large. This hellspawn right here is Worm FALCO, a level 2 with the flip effect. Change all face-up reptile type worm monsters you control to face-down defense position except this card. Feeling a bit of deja vu here, anyone else? Yeah, this is basically a multi-monster version of EROKIN, except this one doesn't have the benefit of having 2400 attack. The effect is also pretty damn irrelevant considering the fact that, like I said before and will probably say multiple times in the future, you rarely ever have enough face-up field presence for these kinds of effects to go off successfully. And what is this thing supposed to be anyway? Summon Holy Ritual Offspring of Dry Bones and Falco Lombardi? This nasal excrement monster from the planet of swine flu goes by the name of Worm GULSE. It's a level 4 with 1500 attack, which gains one worm counter whenever a face-down defense position monster is flipped face-up, and for each worm counter on it, it gains 300 attack. Alright, so worm counters? Where the hell did that come from all of a sudden? Was simply gaining 300 attack too mainstream for Konami, so they had to make it gain counters instead? Only one other card in the game uses worm counters, and only on itself, so the existence of these in the first place makes absolutely no sense. Oh yeah, and the boost is, again, pointless, so that's about it. I'll give credit to Worm Hope for having a cool name and sleek visual design, but the effect is nothing to write home about. If it's flipped face up by an opponent's monster's attack, draw one card, and when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, send one card from your hand to the graveyard. Since there is only one card in the entire archetype that even slightly benefits from being in the graveyard, the only thing Hope is in this case is a Versus Calendul. It only works when attacked, makes you discard when it dies, but oh, it has 1500 defense, so it's totally worth it. Jokes aside, there's no hope for this one. ILLIDAN, wait, wrong picture, there we go, is a level 5 with 2000 attack and the following effect. Each time a card is set on your side of the field, place one worm counter on this card. You can remove 2 worm counters from this card to target one card your opponent controls and destroy it. This borders so close on being the true worm boss monster. It's not once per turn, it can destroy both background monsters, it works with the ever so funny Scrap Iron Scarecrow. True, it's slow and inefficient nowadays and it was definitely not too great even when it came out, but as far as worms go, it could definitely be a lot worse. Speaking of a lot worse, here's Worm JETELIKPSE? JETELIKPSE? I think you might have left out a few vowels here, Konami of America. Well, anyway, it's a frail little level 3 with a flip effect that lets you special summon it in face-up defense position after it was destroyed and sent to the graveyard this turn. To put it simply, it comes back once. Several years ago, when it wasn't that common to have multiple monsters out on the field on your first turn, this might have served as average tribute material, but since we're in a time when it's considered bricking if you start off with less than 3 monsters, JETELIKPSE's revival really doesn't do much. Okay, what the hell is that name even supposed to mean? It's not on Wikipedia, it's not in the Soros, it's not in the Urban Dictionary, it doesn't mean anything in Japanese, Korean, Norwegian or Esperanto, it's not an anagram leading to a complex ARG in which the participants will need to call a secret phone line and name the entirety of Blackwing support backwards in order to win 10 copies of Mint to lightly play Dark Duel Stories Edition Blue Eyes. It's just a bunch of letters. Yes, I am bothered by this. Now here's what's widely considered to be the Worm Boss monster, appropriately titled Worm King. It's a big ass level 8 with 2700 attack, which can be tribute summoned with 1 Worm tribute, and it allows you to tribute a Worm Master to target and destroy one card your opponent controls. Mind you, this isn't once per turn. Basically, this is one of the only ways worms clear the field when they're about to go off, even though going off for worms consists of the same potency as Chainburn Top Decaying Sparks, but going off nonetheless. He has a huge body, you can use some monsters we'll talk about later to fuel his destruction effect. Overall, for back then, this was a tolerable boss monster for an archetype nobody really expected much from, and he's a staple in any deck which attempts to make worms work even in the slightest nowadays. Oh, and did you know he was censored in the TCG because worm vagina? Next up is the worm's amazing source of draw power, that being Worm LINX. Flip. During each end phase, if this card is face up, draw one card. Can you imagine how desperate people were for draw power that this was ran in pretty much every worm deck along with a bunch of protection traps just so you could draw into your combo pieces as fast as possible? But when I look at this effect, I don't see fast, I see a slug sleepily crawling along a floor made out of glue. While I can see the idea behind this card and can somewhat understand people a few years ago going out of their way to flip and protect it for as long as possible, it's still insanely frail, super slow, and you might as well just run Upstart Goblin at this point. Worm MILLIDITH, looking like Earthbound Immortal Uru's ruling 5-year-old brother, has this effect. Flip. You can equip this card to a monster your opponent controls. Inflict 400 damage to that monster's controller during each standby phase. Or, you know, you could not be an absolute idiot and instead play Poison of the Old Man. Seriously though, what the hell kind of weak ass effect is this? Blast Sphere was made 10 years before this and it almost does the same thing but better. They didn't even try. Worm Noble is pretty much the definition of a one-trick pony. It's a level 6 with 2400 defense with a flip effect. If this card is flipped face up by an opponent's monster's attack, inflict damage to your opponent equal to half the attacking monster's attack. Alright, so you went out of your way to tribute set a 2400 defense monster. If the opponent was curious enough to attack it, you might have dealt around 12 to 1500 damage, and now you have a protectionless level 6 with 1500 attack on the field, quite possibly terrified, hungry and freezing while surrounded by imminent death. Now ask yourself, was it worth it, you absolute madman? Next up is probably the funniest name on the list, Worm Opera. Flip. All face-up monsters on the field lose 500 attack except reptile-type worm monsters. Yeah, okay, whatever, the effect is bad, but you just can't hate this guy, look how happy he is! He knows he's ugly, that his effect isn't worth anything, but he's still happy because he's doing his best. And you know what? We could learn some stuff from Worm Opera too! It doesn't matter what you look like, what you do or how you do it, It's only important that you're doing your best and enjoying it like there's no tomorrow. Godspeed, Worm Opera, we all believe in you. What a cool guy. Worm Prince, no sadly not the real prince, this is Worm Prince, is a level 6 with 2200 attack, which allows you to add a reptile type worm monster from your deck to the hand each time it destroys a monster by battle. Sounds okay, right? 2200 attack is enough to beat over a few things. CARTAROS was so far the only oh wait, there's more. Destroy this card during the end phase if you don't control another reptile type worm monster. Why? Why was this necessary? Aesthetic choice? Idiocy? Both? Well, whatever it was, it renders this already mediocre card completely worthless, but at least he has the benefit of looking like he's about to drop some sick beats. Although for some reason they removed the backup dancers from his DCG art. Ranking higher on the ladder of Worm royalty, we have Worm Queen, another level 8 with 2700 attack, obviously an intended secondary boss monster, but... well, you can tribute summon it by using one reptile type worm monster, and once per turn you can tribute a reptile type worm monster to special summon another one from your deck with a lower or equal level to that monster. The main problem with this is that she summons in face up position, which is not something you usually want your worms to be in, and even if she did summon them in face down defense position, you're basically just exchanging one relatively useless monster for another, so all in all, there's not much point to Worm Queen. Freddie Mercury would be ashamed. Now we have Worm RAKUYEH, a level 4 monster with 2100 attack. Oh boy, can't wait to hear the restriction on this one. This card can only declare an attack during the turn it was flipped face up. If this card attacks, it is changed to face down defense position at the end of the battle phase. So basically you set this, hope it survives the opponent's turn with its measly 1200 defense, maybe swing for 2100 next turn in the best possible case, yeah, no. Worm Beatdown, I found Shape Snatch Turbo's lost cousin. Worm Solid does not look comfortable in that triangle at all. The effect is as follows. This card gains 100 defense for each reptile type worm monster in your graveyard. If your opponent takes battle damage from attacking this card, at the end of the damage step you can target and destroy one spell or trap card your opponent controls. Again, I see the idea. If your graveyard is jam-packed with worms, this thing might have a little over 2000 defense and guarantee the destruction of one back row, but it's basically just a simultaneously better and worse worm apocalypse. Better because of more defense and the chance to stay on the field a bit longer after destroying a card, but worse because if the opponent does simply beat over it, all you did was just lose a monster. And seeing how Apocalypse is not worth running, neither is this. Worm Solid? More like Worm Average? Next up is the unimaginative worm Tentacles, because this is an octopus, this one's just an octopus. It has 1700 attack, and by banishing one worm monster from your graveyard you can allow it to attack twice this turn. Well, it's not terrible, in the best possible case it's a level 4 that can swing for 3400 damage, which is admirable, I guess? But if the opponent happens to control a monster with more than 1700 attack, Tentacles is as useful as a rotten octopus on a stick. If this was 5 years ago, I'd say run 1. Next up is... oh my god, that is just sad. Look at this, it looks so pathetic. It's like an infected elephant booger. Lives up to its name, I guess. And so does the effect. When you tribute summon a worm monster by using this card as a tribute, special summon this card to the opponent's side of the field in face-up attack position. I don't know, the early Dual Terminal era had a bit of an obsession with giving your opponent free stuff, even though the advent of Synchros was going on, so that was probably the stupidest thing you can do, and Worm Ugly doesn't really deviate this idea into any playable territory. It's as pointless as they get. And for the love of God, somebody give that thing a hug. I don't want him to be sad, let him hang out with Worm Opera, lift his spirits up a little bit. Now Worm Victory is interesting because it's a level 7 with a flip effect. That flip effect is destroy all face-up monsters on the field except reptile type worm monsters. This card gains 500 attack for each reptile type worm monster in your graveyard. Alright, so I kinda like that flip effect, but then again I am extremely biased towards nuke cards. This is still a level 7 flip effect monster, so you aren't getting much out of it unless you make some workarounds, and the reliance on the graveyard boost to become an even average beater is really annoying. True, there's a support card that makes him easier to bring out, but that would imply you'd have to run this guy in the first place. Next up is Worm Warlord, who clearly lifts as evidenced by his artwork. It's a level 6 with 2350 attack for that Evil Swarm experience and has the following effect. This card cannot be special summoned. Negate the effects of effect monsters destroyed by battle with this card, and if this card destroys a monster by battle, it can attack once again in a row. God, I would love this card if it was only a bit easier to bring out. It has okay stats, wish they were about 200 higher though. It negates destroyed monster effects, which are a huge deal nowadays as we all know, and it can attack twice. But it's still a level 6 that cannot be special summoned for some reason, and as we learned so far, worms very rarely end up having enough tribute fodder out on the field. Damn shame, because this would genuinely be my favorite worm card otherwise. Finally getting to the duo that makes worms only slightly playable, first off is Worms X. Yes, that is an awkward name, I agree. When this card is normal summoned, you can send one reptile type worm monster from your deck to the graveyard. If you control a face-up worm YAGAN, this card cannot be destroyed by battle. Interesting, and what does this worm YAGAN do? If the only monster you control is Worms X, you can special summon this card from your graveyard in face down defense position. If you do, banish it when it leaves the field. When this card is flipped face up, target one face up monster your opponent controls and return it to the hand. You know what this is? Synergy. Something the entire rest of the archetype is not exactly aware of existing. Summon Zax, pitch YAGAN, activate a certain trap I'll mention later, start plussing and disrupt the opponent. This is basically a glimpse of what the archetype could have been capable of, but instead of having synergy between all of its members, they decided to make only two specific monsters work only between each other. But before I explain why Zax and YAGAN are so good when I get to the trap card, there's something else we have to cover. The final letter of the English alphabet, Z, is the mark of Worm 0. A level 10 fusion monster. Now I know what some of you may be thinking, where the hell did a fusion monster come from all of a sudden? No monsters in the archetype offer any kind of fusion support, there was absolutely zero indication that this archetype would even have an extra deck monster, but yep, there it is. And oh boy, it's a thing. The materials are 2 or more reptile type worm monsters, and its attack is equal to the number of fusion materials with different names you used for its fusion summon times 500, and depending on that number it gains these effects. 2 or more. Once per turn you can special summon one reptile type monster from your graveyard in face down defense position. 4 or more. You can banish one reptile type monster from your graveyard to send one monster on the field to the graveyard, and 6 or more. Once per turn you can draw one card. So yeah, all of these effects are actually pretty good, but the problem is in the following. Worms don't have an archetype specific fusion spell, meaning you're forced to use stuff like polymerization to get it out, making it extremely unlikely that you'll ever summon it with more than 3, potentially 4 materials with different names. While future fusion was around, this was significantly easier to do, but since we can't really have that because of Chaos Dragons, Worm 0 remains a tragic, barely playable relic of the past. Run it only if you feel like making yourself a challenge. Before we move on to the trap card, it's worth mentioning the continuous spell Worm Call. Once per turn, if your opponent controls a monster and you control no monsters, you can special summon one reptile type worm monster from your hand in face down defense position. The main faults of this card are 2 things. It's not a field spell, and it requires the opponent to control a monster to use it. If this wasn't the case, it would probably be a staple because you could pull off some more first turn setups and it would be searchable by terraforming, but this way the only use you really have for it is surprising the opponent with Worm Victory, which nobody really runs, same as this card. And we're finally here. I get to talk about one of the best support cards ever made for one of the worst archetypes ever made. W Nebula Meteorite. Strap on because it's quite the effect. Change all face down monsters on the field to face up defense position. During the end phase this turn, change all face up light reptile type monsters you control to face down defense position, then draw one card for each. After that, you can special summon one level 7 or higher light reptile type monster from your deck. Rarely do I ever see a card that hits all the spots so perfectly when it comes to archetype support. First of all, it triggers all worm flip effects when it's activated, meaning you get to search with CARTAROS or bounce with YAGAN during your opponent's turn, and then during the end phase, it makes you plus by letting you draw a card for each monster flip face down, then it gives you a free Worm King, and in the next turn you can trigger the flip effects of the monsters yourself, letting you bounce or search more. It's magnificent! Sure, it's a bit outdated and you'd probably lose all monsters you control before the end of the turn these days, but the card is still a fantastic example of intuitive, synergetic yet balanced card design that managed to give a competitive edge to an archetype that would have otherwise been completely forgotten. So yeah, it's good. Oh boy, time for the grading. Consistency. Well, there's a surprising amount of it when we compare it to other dual terminal archetypes that came around the same era. CARTAROS is a simple searcher, Zex basically equals an instant YAGAN, Meteorite kickstarts the entire deck, and some newer generic reptile support such as King of the Feral Limbs allows you to get your combo pieces a bit faster. It's not exactly Necros, but I'll give them half a point for trying. Power. The attack values are low around these parts. Worm King is the only relevant one in this case, and he's usually ran at 1, so the damage output is not worth mentioning. When it comes to comeback ability, there is none. Worms don't have any archetypal saving grace top decks, and the closest there is to coming back after a beatdown for them is drawing Evil Dragon and Anta, which is most likely to get taken care of in the next turn. Beyond Zex being indestructible by battle while Yagan is on the field, protection is completely and entirely non-existent. Like, wow, Konami completely forgot monsters can actually get affected by card effects when they were making this archetype. And versatility, meh, they have the potential to beat Dragon Rulers as much as they have the potential to beat Summoned Skull beatdown. It's mostly reliant on playing against some decently old decks and drawing into Meteorite, but other than that, they don't stand much of a chance. As for the things that could have been done for the Worms to not suck. Flip effects that aren't extremely passive and meaningless, but instead damaging to the opponent and putting the player into advantage. More spell and trap support. One continuous spell and a single trap card, no matter how good it is just not enough for an archetype that struggles with even getting those cards to the hand in the first place. Fusion support. Something akin to Future Fusion, and maybe a monster that can search out said card and serve as multiple materials for it, would be a great addition to the deck. Worms have a great boss monster, they just have barely any ways of summoning it. Also, the archetype needs direction. This goes for a lot of sets in the Dual Terminal series, but it's still very relevant. Worms don't feel like they have a goal or a win condition. Putting it bluntly, they don't do anything. The monsters need effects which make them work with other monsters, as opposed to each one of them doing their own thing. And at last, an archetype focused around weak flip effect monsters needs a way to recover said flip effect monsters en masse. This technically might fall under the spell and trap support category, but it's so stupidly necessary for the deck that it needs to be pointed out specifically. These things should not die as easily as they do. So basically what I'm saying is just turn them into Shadows. Yeah, objectively looking at it, Shadows are everything Worms tried to be, but better. Which is pretty annoying because, much like what I said about Nordics, I like the team. The visual design on some of the Worms is horrifying, more so than the infamous gimmick puppets. The creepy alien aesthetic fits the eerie concept of flip monsters, which are basically trap cards on legs. But sadly, the archetype fell victim to Konami still being massively inexperienced with the concept of archetypes back in the day. But let's look on the bright side. Dual Terminal gave us so much material for the legacy of the Worthless series that I can basically cover the majority of the hidden Arsenal packs without running out of garbage to dig through. So tune in next time for more Dual Terminal nonsense. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching this episode of Legacy of the Worthless. As always, remember to subscribe and I'll see you next time.